What happens when a holy war for faith turns into a ruthless war for land and power? The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, was one of the darkest and bloodiest chapters of medieval Europe. What began as Pope Innocent III's mission to wipe out the Cathar heresy in southern France quickly escalated into a savage struggle that reshaped the politics and culture of the Languedoc. In this video, we'll follow the dramatic arc of the Crusade, the shocking massacre at Béziers, the fall of Carcassonne, and Simon de Montfort's relentless sieges at Minerve and Lavaur. You'll see how Count Raymond VI of Toulouse tried to navigate impossible choices, and how Simon de Montfort rose to become both the terror and the conqueror of the south. We'll cover pivotal clashes like the Battle of Marais, where a king lost his life, and the desperate struggles at Toulouse, Marmande, and Montségur, where the Cathar cause was finally crushed in fire. This is a story of belief and brutality, of betrayal and ambition. A crusade that began in the name of God, but ended up redrawing the map of France forever. Speaking of changing things forever, this 5-episode series was previously only available to our YouTube members and patrons. We also release 3 new exclusive videos every week, and now our supporters can watch more than 230 exclusive videos, including videos on the Austrian succession, Eastern Front of World War II, Persian Wars, Punic Wars, Reconquista, Pacific War, and more. They also get access to our exclusive Discord, can see our schedule, and get early access to all videos. Join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. The heretic movement targeted by Pope Innocent III was Catharism, a divergent Christian sect which was prominent in the Languedoc region, in what is now southwestern France. Catharism was heavily influenced by the Bulgarian Bogomils, a Christian neo-Gnostic sect. It took root in Western Europe in the first half of the 11th century, and by the 12th century had found a solid stronghold in the Languedoc, particularly in the city of Albi, which is why followers of Catharism were also known as Albigensians. According to the Gnostic or dualist worldview of the Cathars, a good god had created the spiritual world, while an evil god, ergo Satan, was responsible for the creation of everything material. Thus, the ultimate goal of Catharism was to escape the boundaries of the flesh and rejoin in purity the spiritual realm of creation. A minority of the Albigensians, known as perfects, practiced these tenets to the extreme, living a life of total poverty, simplicity, and carnal abstinence. However, the majority of Cathars, simply known as believers, took a looser approach to the sect's teachings, attracting new proselytes amongst farmers, city artisans, and even some feudal lords. At the start of the 13th century, the local Catholic clergy and the papacy were increasingly worried about the Cathar presence in Languedoc. Not only did the Albigensians openly defy established dogmas of Catholic doctrine, they were steadily growing in numbers. They were garnering support from the local aristocracy. This was due to several reasons. Firstly, Cathar priests and bishops demanded relatively low tithes and taxes, making them a preferred alternative to Catholic clergy in the eyes of local landowners and noblemen. Secondly, several members of the aristocracy, especially women, had converted to Catharism, some of them even living as perfects, which meant that the sect had influential spokespeople at the highest level of Languedoc society. Finally, feudal lords and barons in Languedoc chose to offer protection to the Cathars for political reasons. From an administrative and military perspective, the local nobility of the Languedoc owed their allegiances either to the kingdoms of France or Aragon, at least in theory. In practice, Languedoc aristocrats and common folk alike were very protective of their own culture, language, customs, and thriving economy. Protected by the mighty walls of their castra, or fortified cities, they behaved largely independently from their powerful neighbours. Thus, offering protection to the Cathars, or at least refusing to persecute them, was also a matter of protecting their lands against the interference of kings, popes, and other barons in central and northern France. In the first decade of the 13th century, tensions rose to a boiling point as Pope Innocent III grew increasingly antsy in his desire to crush the heresy in the Languedoc, while northern barons and knights were also chomping at the bit, seeing an anti-Cathar crusade as an opportunity to expand their territories at the expense of the southerners. All of this came to a head on the 13th of January 1208, when Papal Legate Peter of Castelnaudary threatened with excommunication the most powerful amongst the southern pro-Cathar leaders, Raymond VI of Toulouse. The assassination of Castelnaudary prompted Innocent III to issue a call for crusade against the Albigensian heretics. The Pope initially asked the French king Philippe Augustus and his son Louis to take leadership of the expedition. Unfortunately for Innocent, the French crown refused to participate, as they were preoccupied with the ongoing conflict with King John of England and the Angevin Empire. However, King Philip did allow many of his feudal lords to join the crusade with their retinues of knights and foot soldiers. These units were joined by large numbers of routiers or mercenaries and ribauds, improvised and ill-equipped crusaders motivated by the Pope's promises of spiritual salvation. According to Innocent's call to arms, Crusaders only had to serve 40 days in the struggle against the heretics in order to gain full indulgence for their sins. Moreover, they would be allowed to maintain any goods plundered in battle. This was an attractive offer to the lords of northern France, since from their perspective, the concept of loot extended to any territorial gains they could carve out in Languedoc. These advantageous conditions attracted huge columns of soldiers, which assembled in Lyon on the 24th of June 1209. According to the chronicler William of Tudela, the Crusaders amounted to 20,000 fully armed knights and a staggering 200,000 foot soldiers. More realistically, however, the entire Crusader army never grew larger than 20,000 overall troops, and this number constantly shifted over time as contingents joined and left following the 40-day rule. The sizes of the southern or pro-Cathar forces throughout the Crusades are also hard to estimate, as several lords frequently switched sides according to their own interests. After the initial assembly, Papal Legate Arnauld d'Amaury led the Crusaders southwards, following the path of the River Rhône. On the 2nd of July 1209, the column reached Valence, where the first switch of allegiances took place. Here, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, once a fiery opponent of the Papal Legates, pledged allegiance to Aumery and asked to join the crusade. The march resumed until Montpellier, where another local nobleman came forward asking to join the fight against heresy. His name was Raymond Roger Trinquevel, the 24-year-old Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne. The young Viscount admitted to the Papal Legate that his lands contained many Cathars, but that he had never supported them. Callously, Arnauld d'Amaury ignored his pleas and informed Trinquevel that the church would neither show him nor the city of Béziers any mercy. His hand having been forced, Viscount Trinquevel then hastily rode back to Béziers to organize his city's defenses against the oncoming Crusader army, ordering the city militia to defend the bridge on the River Aube, deepening the city's defensive ditches and closing its gates. He then left for nearby Carcassonne to seek reinforcements. However, before the Viscount could return, on the 21st of July, the Crusader army arrived in front of the city walls. Settling in for a siege, the noblemen, knights, and the better-equipped men-at-arms set up camp on a sandy plain southwest of Béziers' citadel, at a safe distance from possible enemy sorties. Meanwhile, the mercenaries and poor crusaders set up their tents by the river, closer to the city gates. Initially, the crusade host tried to negotiate, using the Bishop of Béziers as an intermediary, who urged the citizens to surrender. In response, the people of Béziers replied that they would rather be drowned in the salt sea than concede the Crusaders a penny worth of their possessions. This defiance was born from the fact that the defenders believed that the mighty walls and ditches of their city would hold off the attackers for longer than the 40 days of military service required by the Pope. However, not everyone behind the city walls was interested in waiting the Crusaders out. In the early hours of the 22nd of July 1209, a band of impatient young Béziers militiamen sallied forth from the portcullis, attacking the unimpressive Ribot camp, and clashing with a group of mercenaries on the bridge over the Orbe. Awakened by the screams, the leader of the Ribaud ordered an immediate assault on the city, which was joined also by the Routier's mercenary units. In the ensuing melee, some of the mercenaries were able to fight their way into the city before the gates could be closed, and proceeded to climb onto the city walls, engaging with the guards on the fortifications. The mercenaries then rampaged through the streets of Béziers, killing and plundering unopposed. Hundreds of citizens sought refuge in the Saint-Nazaire Cathedral and other churches, but the mercenaries spared no one, murdering even women and children and members of the clergy. Finally, the Crusader Knights took notice of the commotion and decided to enter the fray. Trying to impose some discipline, they prevented the mercenaries from plundering further. But they did little to curb the massacres. According to Caesarius of Heisterbach, the knights asked Legate Omery how they were going to tell the Catholics from the Cathars in Béziers, to which the legate replied, "Kill them all. The Lord knows who are his own." And so they did, slaughtering 1,000 citizens inside Sainte Mary Magdalene Church alone. The knights then proceeded to confiscate the loot from the Ribaud and the mercenaries. In protest, the poorer ranks set fire to several timber buildings in the city. In a matter of hours, one of the main pro-Cathar centres in Languedoc had fallen, while an unknown number of Cathars and Catholics, probably well in the thousands, had been put to death. Emboldened by their victory, the Crusaders then moved on to their next objective, the city of Carcassonne, 80 kilometers southwest of Béziers, where they would square off with the Viscount Tronquevel. Leadership of this siege would be assumed by a northern nobleman and veteran of fighting in the Holy Land, Count Simon de Montfort. Like Béziers, Carcassonne boasted impressive walls and defensive measures, but it had a considerable weakness in that its main water supply was the River Aude, some 400 meters from the city's perimeter. On the 1st of August, the Crusader army swiftly surrounded Carcassonne, cutting the defenders off from the river. 2 days later, the invading Catholics launched their first attack against the Bourg, an unfortified suburb west of the main city. Knowing that this suburb was impossible to defend, the Viscount Tronquevel had already had it evacuated. Subsequently, de Montfort's men were able to storm and burn the Bourg within 2 hours. From there, they proceeded to attack another detached suburb to the north, the Castelnaudary. This area was protected by ditches and high fortifications, from which the defenders hurled stones and shot crossbow quarrels at the attackers. The Crusaders responded by building an array of siege engines to flush out the Cathars. First, mangonels were constructed, designed to hurl rocks along a low angle against the city's defences. Next, Montfort ordered the building of a cat, a mobile wooden tower draped in fireproof animal hide, which protected footmen and sappers as they approached the walls. On the 8th of August, the besiegers succeeded in breaching the walls of the Castelnaudary, storming in and pushing the defenders back into the main city. However, Count de Montfort only left a small force guarding the Castelnaudary, which prompted Viscount Tronquevel's men to stage a counterattack. A sortie from within the walls of Carcassonne successfully set the Castelnaudary on fire before retreating back into the city. After this engagement, an impasse followed, with the Crusaders unable to break through the walls of the main city, while inside the city, the defenders were suffering the consequences of heat, dehydration, and dysentery. Nominally, the Tronquevel family and Carcassonne owed allegiance to King Peter II of Aragon, and naturally, the sovereign was not happy that an army of northern Frenchmen was rampaging through the lands of his vassals, so he decided to mediate the situation. The king offered to Viscount Tronquevel a deal devised by the papal legate Omery. According to the terms, Tronquevel and 11 of his followers would be spared. Everyone else in Carcassonne was to be killed. Naturally, the young Viscount rejected the offer, and fighting resumed. De Montfort's soldiers proceeded to attack the walls of the main city. First, they filled the ditches with bundles of wood, before trying to scale the walls. The defenders repelled the assaults by raining down bolts, stones, and even boiling oil over the Crusaders. As time wore on, de Montfort realized he needed to conclude the siege quickly, The 40 days of service were coming to an end, meaning the bulk of his host would be free to walk home with a papal indulgence. However, time was also running out for the defenders. Inside the walls, Tronquevel's forces realized they could not hold out for much longer, as the water supplies were dwindling and dysentery was rife amongst citizens and soldiers. On the 14th of August, Raymond Roger de Tronquevel entered the enemy camp for another round of negotiations with the Count of Nevers and Legate Aumery. They offered to spare the citizens of Carcassonne, Catholics and Cathars alike, provided they left the city immediately, carrying no possessions with them. The Viscount agreed to the offer, thus sparing his city from destruction. He himself would not be so lucky, as Aumery had him incarcerated. Tronquevel died of dysentery later that year. In less than 2 months, the Crusader army had conquered 2 powerful strongholds of the pro-Cathar forces. Subsequently, Carcassonne, well positioned and well defended, would become their headquarters for the rest of the campaign. However, not all was peachy for the invaders, for they were now facing a leadership problem. Arnauld Aumery had to appoint a unified military leader for the crusade, but with the 40 days of service almost elapsed, most noblemen and knights were eager to return home. Powerful aristocrats such as the Duke of Burgundy refused the appointment as commander of the Crusaders, wary of the risks of victory as much as those of defeat, as acquiring lands in Languedoc would likely put the Duke on a collision course with the Kingdom of France. Eventually, long-term leadership of the Crusader army fell upon the man who had led them to victory at Carcassonne, Simon de Montfort. A capable tactician and devout Catholic, de Montfort would rise as the main military figure of the first part of the Albigensian Crusade. Throughout the rest of 1209, Montfort led his armies through Languedoc, conquering castrum after castrum. Despite the numbers of his army dwindling due to the 40-day rule, the Northern Count and the Crusaders were preceded by a reputation for military superiority and ruthlessness, earned at Béziers and Carcassonne. In a matter of weeks, Castres, Fanjeaux, Puy-le-Roc, Mirepoix, Saverdeux and many other castra opened their gates to the Crusaders, offering a token resistance at best. Even the city of Albi, one of the initial hotbeds of Catharism, pledged allegiance to the knights from the north. This flurry of easy victories proved a double-edged sword for Montfort, as he was forced to leave part of his army behind to garrison each newly conquered castrum, leaving him in a position of progressive weakness against the southern lords, whose fierce and vengeful resurgence was on the horizon. Montfort's attempts to hold this conquered territory would be constantly frustrated by the 40-day rule sanctioned by the Pope, wherein the Crusaders only needed to serve 40 days before returning home with a plenary indulgence. Due to this, many soldiers in Montfort's force simply abandoned their war effort once the terms of service had expired. As a result, the stronghold of Pissaguier, conquered by the Crusaders in the autumn of 1209, was liberated in early 1210 by the pro-Cathar southern noble Giraud de Peppieux. Seeking revenge for the atrocities committed by the Northerners in their initial conquest, Peppieux had the Crusader garrison in Pissaguier thrown into a ditch and covered in stones and combustible material. Then he retreated to the nearby castrum of Minerve, taking 2 knights hostage. Once there, he gouged the knights' eyes and cut off their lips, noses and ears. He then had them stripped naked and abandoned them in the freezing countryside. Only one of them survived, and was able to reach the Crusader headquarters in Carcassonne. When the survivor told his story, Montfort was apoplectic and set out to exact retribution. In the spring of 1210, his forces laid siege to the small castrum of Bram, conquering it in just 3 days. In a direct echo of Peppieux's atrocities, the Crusaders took 100 Bram soldiers prisoner, blinded them, and cut their noses off. Only 1 soldier was left with a single eye, so he could lead the other 99 to the nearby fortress of Cabaret and serve as a warning. To complete his revenge, Montfort prepared for the capture of Minerve, a nigh impregnable castrum of vital strategic importance. The town was defended by a small garrison of only 200 soldiers, but it was heavily fortified. What made Minerve truly formidable was its geography, for it was set atop a high plateau, surrounded by 90-meter-high cliffs, and protected on two sides by the deep gorges of the rivers Brienne and Cesse. In the spring of 1210, Montfort received some much-needed reinforcements, as his wife, Alice, rode into Languedoc with a large contingent of Crusader knights, eager to fulfill their 40-day obligation to the Pope. Montfort kicked off the campaign by raiding the countryside around Minerve, isolating the defenders from potential reinforcements and cutting off their supply lines. Then, in June, he proceeded to encircle Minerve. Montfort proceeded to set up camp to the east of the castrum, near the Brienne River, while his deputy, Arnaud of Narbonne, occupied the shores of the Cesse to the west. With this move, the Crusaders had effectively cut off the defenders' main water supplies. After settling in for a siege, Montfort immediately identified the weakness of the castrum, the height of the land opposite the river gorges, a perfect vantage point, an ideal position to place his fearsome siege engines. A mangonel, commanded by Arnaud of Narbonne, was positioned to the west of the town. Moreover, 3 trebuchets targeted the fortifications from the north, south and east. The eastern siege engine was particularly insidious due to its size and intended use. The chronicler Peter of Lavaux de Sarnay described this trebuchet as a huge and most effective petrary. Another chronicler, William of Toledo, described the machine as the queen and lady of all siege engines, and nicknamed it Malvoisine, or Bad Neighbour. According to contemporary historians, the Bad Neighbour may have been able to lob stones weighing 150 kilograms over a distance of 150 meters, at a rate of 1 shot every 10 minutes. The projectiles hurled by Montfort's machine were aimed directly towards the castrum's main remaining source of water, the well within its walls. After days of bombardment, and with water reserves running dry, the defenders decided to attempt a sortie on the 18th of July. Under the cover of darkness, the Minerve militia waded the Brienne, scaled the gorge up to the Bad Neighbour, and planted baskets filled with combustible materials such as wood and fat. As they set the baskets on fire, a Crusade engineer who had left camp to relieve himself spotted the sortie and raised the alarm. The guards intervened before the flames could destroy the trebuchet, and the Crusaders narrowly avoided a disaster. Thereafter, the campaign of bombing resumed immediately. As dehydration and disease took their toll, on the 22nd of July, the lord of the town, William of Minerve, agreed to engage in peace talks with Montfort. One of Montfort's captains, Robert of Morveson, wished to slaughter all of the inhabitants of Minerve. His demands were toned down by Montfort, and surprisingly by the papal legate Arnaldo Marie, who had previously encouraged wholesale massacres of Cathars. Eventually, the Crusaders agreed to spare the city and its inhabitants, provided they renounced the heresy and converted back to Catholicism. Most of the townfolk accepted to abjure their beliefs, including William, who joined the Crusader ranks. Only 140 Cathar hardliners, known as perfects, refused to compromise and were thus burned alive at the stake. After the conquest of Minerve, Montfort and the Crusaders proceeded to besiege the town of Termes, which fell in November of 1210. Then, in January 1211, Montfort and Amaury met in Montpellier with Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, the most powerful among the lords of Languedoc, who had initially supported the Cathars before switching to the Crusader side. During the meeting, Count Raymond rejected several demands levied upon him by the Crusaders, including the expulsion of Cathars from his lands and his participation in an expedition to the Holy Land. As a result, Raymond switched sides again, becoming a figurehead of pro-Cathar resistance and prompting the defection of several other southern lords. One of these southern lords, Aymeric de Mauriel, had set camp at the castrum of Lavaur, which Montfort attacked in April 1211. Short on troops, Montfort had to content himself with bombarding the castrum with his siege engines while he awaited reinforcements. Unfortunately for him, those reinforcements would never arrive. A relief column of 600 German and Frisian Crusaders had set off from Carcassonne to join the siege. The Crusaders were crossing the hills near Montségur, some 27 kilometers south of Lavaur, when they were ambushed by a southern force. This attack was led by Raymond Roger, Count of Foix, a fierce Cathar who had several perfects among his family. Foix offered no quarter, and the Crusaders were killed almost to the last man, with one of the few survivors managing to escape to Lavaur and informing Montfort of the massacre. Montfort was naturally infuriated, but he could not go after the Count of Foix yet, for he still had to deal with the Castrum of Lavaur. Fortunately for Montfort, his engineers were making good progress in breaching the fortress by employing a cat, or mobile tower. Under its cover, the sappers mined the foundations of the outer walls, opening a breach. Montfort was thus able to conquer Lavaur on the 3rd of May. As was typical of the Albigensian Crusade, this victory was followed by a slew of atrocities. Aymeric, the pro-Cathar garrison commander, was sentenced to hang alongside 90 of his knights. When the gallows toppled under their weight, Montfort had their throats slit. Aymeric's sister, Giraldin de Larac, was thrown into a well and buried alive under a heap of stones. Finally, between 300 and 400 Cathars were marched out of town and burned alive at the stake. Next, Montfort marched on to the nearby castle of Puylaurens, which quickly surrendered. Finally, the northern lords raided Montségur to avenge the death of their German reinforcements. The village was burned to the ground and its inhabitants were massacred. This series of gruesome successes emboldened Montfort to set his eyes on the largest and most powerful city of Languedoc, Toulouse. However, his encirclement of the city, starting on the 17th of June, would turn out to be a political, strategic, and tactical blunder. Before the start of the siege, the Toulousians' loyalties were actually divided. Many of them were wary of the Cathars and would probably have been won over to the Crusader cause. Upon hearing news of the approaching army, the citizens asked their bishop, Fulk, to mediate with the Crusaders. The bishop, a fierce anti-Cathar, vehemently refused, urging instead for the Toulousians to provide unconditional support to Montfort. His exhortations had the opposite effect, and the city opted for resisting the siege and siding squarely with the pro-Cathars. From a tactical and military standpoint, the siege of Toulouse was a debacle. Montfort, marred once more by the 40-day rule, simply lacked the manpower and resources to either effectively cut off the city or deploy his fearsome siege engines. All the Crusaders could do was attack the suburban fields and gardens, which supplied the main city with fruit and wine. According to William of Toledo, the Crusader raids only inflicted some 33 casualties amongst the suburban farmers. In retaliation, Toulousians staged several sorties against the Crusader camp, killing at least one Crusader commander, Eustace of Cailleux. Unable to break the defences, Montfort decided to lift the siege on the 29th of June, diverting his forces to instead threaten the citadel of Foix, the seat of Raymond Roger, the man responsible for the ambush at Montségur. However, the defences of Raymond Roger's castrum proved too formidable for Montfort's depleted forces, and the Crusaders could only content themselves with raiding his undefended hinterlands. By now, Montfort's reputation for invincibility had been thoroughly tarnished, which prompted several southern lords to turn against the Crusaders and recapture several castra from their hands. As the tide was turning, Raymond of Toulouse decided to take the initiative against the invaders. In July, he assembled a vast army, which according to William of Toledo numbered 200,000 troops, which is admittedly most likely a wild exaggeration. The Southerners then moved towards Carcassonne, seeking a direct confrontation with the Crusaders' main base of operations. Seeing a large front of opposition approaching, an English crusader, Hugh de Lacy, advised Simon de Montfort to lure Raymond away from Carcassonne and into a trap by moving to the weakest castle he possessed. Simon listened to the advice and rode with 500 men into the castrum of Castelnaudary. As expected, Raymond took the bait, laying siege to the castle in September of 1211. From the start, Raymond made a series of tactical mistakes. The pro-Cathars had set up camp on La Pêche, a nearby hill. Rather than ordering an encirclement of the enemy castrum, Raymond took a defensive stance, building a system of ditches, fences, and palisades to protect his camp. Next, he ordered his siege engineers to bombard Castelnaudary with a large trebuchet, which may have rivaled the bad neighbour in size and range. but the inexperienced besiegers hurled ineffective projectiles which did no harm against the castrum walls. Raymond Roger de Foix, fiercest among the southern lords, launched an assault against the fortress, but was driven back. In return, Montfort himself led a sortie against the enemy camp, but the defensive works effectively repulsed him. To break the impasse, Montfort sent 2 knights to Carcassonne, requesting reinforcements and supplies. A column of 120 knights and mercenaries was dispatched from the Crusader headquarters, but de Foix got wind of the plan and prepared to intercept the relief party at Saint-Martin-le-Land, 6 kilometers east of Castelnaudary. Montfort, 1 step ahead of his foe, dispatched 43 knights and their retinues from Castelnaudary in reinforcement, thereby setting the stage for one of the only pitched battles of the entire conflict. The Count de Foix commanded some 2,000 men, which he divided into 3 units. His heavy cavalry took position in the centre, with their flanks protected by infantry on one wing and light horsemen on the other. On the other side, the Crusader commander, the knight Bouchard de Marly, could deploy only 400 men, mostly heavy cavalry. Bouchard took the initiative, boldly charging the centre of Foix's lines. After initial success, the outnumbered Crusaders were driven back. Bouchard's knights managed to retreat in good order, but his mercenaries fled in panic. Thereafter, the Southerners advanced towards the retreating Crusaders, but their own mercenaries broke battle discipline by wasting precious time to loot the Northerners' baggage train. This gave the opportunity for Montfort to ride out of Castelnaudary and join the fight at the head of 50 knights, leaving only 5 knights and their retinue behind to protect the castrum. Surprisingly, Raymond did not take the opportunity to storm the castle walls. Back in Saint-Martin, the Crusaders attacked again, with Montfort and Bouchard each leading their units against the wings of Foix's formation. Crushed in a pincer of heavy cavalry, Foix's lighter units crumbled and fled the field. The Count, his son, and a small contingent of knights offered fierce resistance, until they too were forced to retreat. The defeat at Saint-Martin prompted Raymond to lift the siege of Castelnaudary and return to Toulouse, having accomplished very little. However, his ally, Raymond Roger of Foix, would manage to turn this tactical defeat into a strategic victory. In an act of simple cunning, Count de Foix spread the word around Languedoc that the Crusaders had lost at Saint-Martin and that Simon de Montfort had been hanged. This rumour prompted a further wave of anti-Crusader rebellion across the region. Because of this, Montfort had to spend the winter of 1211 and 1212 recapturing those castra that had renounced their allegiance to him after the events at Toulouse and Castelnaudary. To his credit, he was able to do this, reconquering among others Cahuzac, Gaillac, Legate, Montségur, Montferrand, Pouilly-Salcy and Rabiston. Montfort's suppression campaign found new vigour in May of 1212, when he received strong reinforcement from France. At the head of a larger army, Montfort was able to extend control over 7 further castra. At this point in time, it appears that the Crusade leaders' war aims had shifted significantly. Whilst Montfort was initially convinced of the need to eradicate the Cathar heresy, he now appeared bent on expanding his personal dominion over Languedoc. What had started as a religious conflict was now morphing into a war of conquest. At the start of 1213, Montfort had consolidated his control over most of Languedoc, the only 2 major cities still resisting his rule being Toulouse and Montauban. Unable to take the centres by siege, Montfort proceeded to raid the countryside surrounding them in order to weaken the resolve of the defenders. During one such raid, he invaded the territories of Comminges, some 100 kilometers south of Toulouse. This was a strategic faux pas, as the town was under the suzerainty of King Peter II of Aragon, brother-in-law to Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. Peter vehemently complained to Pope Innocent III, who at the time was preparing a new expedition to the Holy Land, the Fifth Crusade. The pontiff had decided to focus his attention on the new adventure, and used the occasion of Peter's protest to place a moratorium on the Albigensian Crusade. This was a hard blow for Simon de Montfort. Without the allure of plenary indulgence, it would be very difficult to continue motivating northern knights to join the crusade against the Cathars. Nevertheless, Montfort decided to press on, continuing to harass and raid the countryside of Languedoc. His stubbornness was rewarded when the bishops of Auxerre and Orléans arrived in the spring, each at the head of a contingent of Crusaders. It appeared that these reinforcements simply had not been informed yet about the papal moratorium. For Montfort, these reinforcements could not have come at a better time, for Peter II was gathering an army of 1,000 Aragonese and Catalonian heavy cavalry, eager to evict the Crusaders from Languedoc once and for all. As they crossed the Pyrenees, they were joined by a further 600 pro-Cathar knights. The allies then marched towards Marais, a small castrum on the Garonne River, south of Toulouse, held by a garrison of 30 Crusader knights. On the 10th of September 1213, the Toulousan militia reached Marais on their river barges and unloaded their 6 heavy siege engines. Raymond's men commenced the bombardment of the castrum walls, and the defenders retreated to the inner keep, waiting for Montfort to arrive with reinforcements from Fongeau, some 70 kilometers east. When Peter II of Aragon got wind of Montfort's arrival, he ordered the militia to stop the bombardment of Marais temporarily. The Aragonese king's plan was to allow the castle a moment of reprieve, so when Montfort arrived, he could enter the castrum with his army, at which point the Aragonese would cordon off Marais, isolating the bulk of the Crusader army and wipe them out in one swift blow. Sure enough, Simon de Montfort arrived at Marais in the evening of the 11th of September, and as per King Peter's orders, he was allowed to enter the walls undisturbed. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who had previous knowledge of the Crusaders' aggressive tactics, advised the southern coalition to protect their camp with ditches and palisades. But the Aragonese monarch overruled him, ordering an all-out assault on Marais. The attack was repulsed by the defenders, with heavy losses on both sides. According to an anonymous chronicler, blood spurt so freely that you would have seen the whole gate dyed scarlet. The following day, Montfort was able to replenish his ranks with fresh reinforcements from Carcassonne, the Crusader headquarters. It was now time for him to take the initiative and bait his opponents into a pitched battle. To that end, Montfort led a large contingent of 700 cavalry and 300 foot soldiers outside the southern gate of Marais. He was then able to maneuver unseen by the southerners by following a narrow path shielded by the castrum walls on one side and the Garonne River on the other. Montfort thus conducted his column to a field northwest of Marais and prepared for battle. He arranged his cavalry into 3 lines. The first line was to be commanded by his half-brother, William de Bar. The second line was under Knight Bouchard de Marly, while Montfort himself would lead the third line. The Count then ordered his infantry not to engage with the enemy, but to await in reserve to protect the cavalry in case of retreat. On the opposite side, Peter II similarly laid out his Aragonese and Catalonian cavalry along 3 lines, with their right flank protected by a stream, and the left by a marsh. However, the King of Aragon committed several tactical mistakes. First of all, he had failed to provide clear battle orders to the knights in the first line of cavalry. Then, dismissive of Count Raymond's defensive tactics, he had decided to engage the enemy without Toulousian support. Finally, King Peter had chosen to swap armour with one of his knights, and to lead the second line of cavalry, rather than wait with the third line in reserve. The Crusaders opened the engagement when their first 2 lines of heavy cavalry charged together against the first line of the Aragonese. Peter's knights, each acting independently, crumbled under the attack. The Crusaders continued the charge and collided with the second enemy line, engaging in a melee. At this stage, Montfort's third line sprung their trap. Having found a path crossing the marshland on the enemy's flank, they encircled the coalition and smashed into their left side, routing and massacring most of their knights. Peter II of Aragon himself, unrecognized in his plain armour, was unhorsed and killed by Crusader Alain de Roussy. Meanwhile, the Toulousian militia had resumed the siege of Muret, confident that Peter II would soon return victorious. As they saw Montfort's cavalry heading towards them instead, they hastily retreated towards their boats, moored on the Garonne. Their chaotic escape sealed their fate, as many were cut down by the pursuing Crusader knights, and many more drowned in the river. The Toulousian Aragonese forces suffered between 5,000 and 10,000 dead, wounded and captured. On the other hand, Montfort may have lost as little as 8 men, and likely no more than 100. Peter II, the Crusaders' most dangerous opponent, had been killed, and his army destroyed. As for Raymond VI of Toulouse, he went into exile, seeking refuge with King John of England. To make matters worse for the Southerners and the Cathars, Montfort now had a free hand in expanding his control over the county of Toulouse, whilst the southern pro-Cathar lords were in disarray. However, despite his many successes, Montfort was never able to quit while he was ahead, and this hubris would lead to his ultimate demise. In 1214, Hugh de Revignon, the Lord of Castelnaudary, renounced his oath of fealty to the Crusaders and switched sides to the pro-Cathars. Naturally, Montfort set out to besiege the rebellious Castrum, arriving at its walls on the 28th of June 1214. Montfort's engineers laid out a mobile bridge to cross the river protecting Castelnaudary, a tactic which backfired when the bridge collapsed and sank under its own weight. Their second attempt was equally catastrophic, as they realized too late that the new, lighter bridge was too short to cover the width of the river. For their third attempt, the Crusaders deployed a cat, or mobile tower, to protect the engineers while they built a causeway over the river. This tactic worked, and the cat was able to roll under the walls of the castrum. Only then the besiegers realized they had failed to bring along ladders to storm the ramparts. Despite all these comical setbacks, Montfort was eventually able to muster a final assault in late August and storm the castle. However, when the Crusaders entered Castelnaudary, they realized that Hugh de Revignon had already evacuated the town. Part of the southern garrison returned to set the castrum on fire, but were intercepted by the Crusaders. A fuming Montfort had them massacred, alongside the remaining inhabitants of Castelnaudary. Finally, Montfort ordered for the fortifications of the castrum to be dismantled. This would become his new strategy whenever conquering a new enemy stronghold. By nullifying the defensive potential of the castra, the Crusader count effectively prevented future rebellions. Throughout 1214 and 1215, Montfort continued to campaign in Languedoc, and even in bordering Aquitaine, creating a personal crusade of territorial conquest. But soon, he would once again receive official backing from Rome. In January 1215, a council convened in Montpellier by Papal Legate Peter of Benevento recommended for Montfort to be made the Lord of the city and county of Toulouse, a huge diplomatic victory. In April, under papal pressure, Prince Louis of France descended into Languedoc at the head of a large army to quell any remaining Cathar dissent. With the prince on his side, Montfort was able to take possession of Toulouse in May, without encountering any resistance. Finally, in November 1215, Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council, during which he met with representatives of both Montfort's forces and the pro-Cathar barons. The southern lords were represented by Raymond VII, the 18-year-old son of Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. After hearing pleas from both sides, Innocent III decided to fully reinstate the crusade against the Cathars, including the reward of a plenary indulgence. Moreover, the Pope legitimized Montfort's claims on the lands he had conquered in Languedoc. This was a heavy blow for both Raymonds. However, the Toulousian nobles were not ready to give up quite yet. Both the father and son still held power over the Marquisate of Provence, which thus far had been spared from the horrors of the Albigensian Crusade. By touring Provence, they were able to raise funds, supplies and soldiers ready to strike back. Raymond VII and Montfort first squared off at the castrum of Beaucaire, 90 kilometers northwest of Marseille, where the teenage Toulousian leader had been born. On the 30th of May 1216, the Crusader cavalry attempted to storm Beaucaire, but were decisively repelled by Raymond Jr.'s forces. The young lord then effectively cut off the Crusader castle by erecting barricades around its perimeter and cutting off access to the nearby River Rhône. Montfort set off to rescue his Crusaders with a mercenary force, launching 4 consecutive assaults on Beaucaire. Each time, Raymond was successful in repulsing the attackers. At the same time, the teenage lord tried to storm the Crusader castle, but his efforts were stumped by the ingenuity of the defenders, who used incendiary bombs made with pitch and sulfur to great effect. After the 4th failed attempt to take the castrum, Montfort agreed to negotiate and lifted the siege on the 24th of August 1216. Thus, Raymond VII, young and unproven, had defeated the formidable leader of the Crusaders. While at Beaucaire, Montfort had received messages warning him that Toulouse was about to rise against his rule. After the defeat at Beaucaire, the Crusader army rode to the city, ready for a fight. They were greeted by a delegation, reassuring them that the Toulousians had no intention to rebel. However, Montfort, now thoroughly paranoid, had the delegation imprisoned and set his soldiers on the city anyway. Despite fierce street fighting, the Crusaders were able to take the city and set fire to several districts. From September to November 1216, Montfort oversaw a draconian occupation, taking several hostages and destroying much of Toulouse's fortifications. News of Montfort's defeat at Beaucaire and the subsequent ill treatment of the Toulousians spread through Languedoc, prompting uprisings by the pro-Cathar forces. The Crusader leader started the year 1217 by recapturing some of the castra lost to the Southerners. This time he could count on reinforcements from King Philippe II Augustus of France. Eager to extend his reach over the south, the monarch had dispatched 100 knights with their retinues to participate in the crusade. While Montfort was campaigning through Languedoc and Provence against Raymond VII, his father, Raymond VI, seized the occasion to strike. Under the cover of thick fog, on the 13th of September 1217, he stealthily recaptured Toulouse. Simon de Montfort was alerted by his wife, Alice, and rapidly returned to Toulouse on the 8th of October. In the meantime, Raymond VI had ordered the walls and fortifications to be rebuilt. Montfort immediately realized that he did not have enough forces to encircle the entirety of the city. Thus he decided to concentrate them in front of the Montségur gate on the east side of Toulouse. This proved ineffective, as the initial assaults of the Crusaders were brutally repelled by the determined Toulousians, who targeted their foes with their mangonels and crossbows. A bolt shot by the Count of Comminges struck down Simon de Montfort's son, the 15-year-old Guy. A Crusader knight, Foucault de Béziers, proposed to build an entirely new town, a new Toulouse, to supply and lodge the besiegers while they raided the Toulousian countryside. As the town was being built, Montfort launched a further assault on the city, but the Toulousians deployed a double trebuchet, whose fast fire broke the momentum of the attack. In December 1217, Montfort realized that Toulouse would not fall to him unless he could bolster his manpower, so he dispatched his wife, Alice, and Bishop Fulk to Paris on a recruitment campaign. They were successful, and between January and May 1218, Montfort received several hundred reinforcements. In mid-June, Toulouse also received reinforcements, 500 knights, headed by the young Raymond VII. The fresh southern forces had arrived just in time. Under cover of a providential storm, and just as Montfort had successfully occupied the Saint-Cyprien suburb, Raymond Roger, Count of Foix, one of the fiercest pro-Cathar leaders, launched the freshly arrived knights into a counterattack, sallying out of the city gates and pushing back Montfort's men towards the Garonne River. Montfort slipped with his horse into the river during the retreat and only narrowly avoided drowning. To break the stalemate, Montfort ordered his engineers to build a huge cat that could house 400 soldiers and 150 archers. While it was being built, the Crusaders tried to seize control of the Garonne River, but the Toulousians held on to the waterway after a brief naval battle. Montfort's cat was ready on the 24th of June, and the commander himself helped to push it against the Montulio Gate. But the defenders were ready to fire back. One of their trebuchets, operated by the women of Toulouse, scored a direct hit against the cat, breaking its axle and killing several occupants. Montfort ordered for the cat to be immediately repaired, and the defenders realized they had to get rid of the threat once and for all. On the 25th of June, they staged a large sortie, climbing down from their city walls and into the Crusader camp. They then broke into the mobile tower, setting it on fire. While Simon de Montfort was attending mass in the nearby Château Narbonnais, a huge melee broke out in the Crusader camp. As soon as he was informed of the attack, the Crusader thus ended his prayers. "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation." And then he rode into battle. As soon as he reached the camp, he saw how his brother Guy had been struck by 2 southern arrows. As Montfort dismounted and rushed to help his brother, a group of Toulousian noblewomen and girls positioned a mangonel on the battlements. One of the stones they hurled landed squarely onto Montfort's head, immediately shattering his skull. As troubadours would later sing, "Montfort is dead, long live Toulouse, city glorious and mighty. Fortune and honour once more are hers, Montfort is dead." Count Simon IV of Montfort was dead, and his brother Guy was severely wounded. The news spread quickly through the Crusader camp, shattering their morale. The northern knights and soldiers abandoned the fight and fled to the safety of Château Narbonnais. Montfort's son, the 18-year-old Amaury, took command of the besieging army and launched an assault on the 1st of July. This attack also ended in a defeat, and on the 25th of July 1218, the Crusaders lifted the siege. After the death of Simon de Montfort, newly elected Pope Honorius III urged the French crown to take leadership of the crusade. King Philippe Augustus dispatched his son, Prince Louis, once again to the south in November 1218, at the head of 600 knights and 10,000 foot soldiers. His destination was Marmande, some 160 kilometers northwest of Toulouse. This southern pro-Cathar stronghold had been under attack since December of 1218. The town defences had been organised by Raymond VI of Toulouse, who had garrisoned the castrum with German mercenaries under the command of one Sontul d'Esterec. Outside the walls, Amaury de Montfort, son of the late infamous Simon de Montfort, was laying siege. In January 1219, he had received strong reinforcements from his mother Alice and knight Beauchard de Marly. The siege of Marmande began when Amaury's troops crossed the Garonne River and tried to storm the walls, but were repulsed by d'Esterec. Due to this initial setback, Amaury decided to dig in and wait for Prince Louis to arrive with his mighty army. Meanwhile, a second major front had been opened by the southerners in the Legate area, some 40 kilometers southeast of Toulouse. The region had fallen to Crusader control, but one of the fiercest southern leaders, Raymond Roger, Count de Foix, had launched a brazen raiding campaign, seizing supplies and diverting troops from the main action at Marmande. 2 Crusader knights, the Beziers brothers, launched a similar campaign in response, devastating the Legate countryside in reprisal for the Count de Foix's actions. Foix was soon joined by Raymond VII of Toulouse, who brought along a force of Spanish mercenaries. The build-up of the opposing forces culminated in the spring, when they met at Béziers, one of the very few pitched battles of the entire crusade. The Count de Foix arranged his heavy cavalry into 2 lines. His son, Roger Bernard, would lead the charge of the first line, while the Count would follow up at the head of the second line. Meanwhile, Raymond VII of Toulouse and his illegitimate half-brother, Bernard, would be riding alongside him. On the Crusader side, battle orders were given by Foucault de Béziers. As the first line of the southern knights came charging, he instructed the bulk of his cavalry to dismount and form a line to absorb the impact of the southern charge. With the first line stalled, the rest of the Crusader cavalry, led by Jean de Béziers, rode forth, engaging the second line of the southerners. In the mounted melee that followed, Raymond VII engaged with de Béziers, knocking him off his horse. A southern knight who had defected to the Crusaders, Pierre de Séguret, charged against the young Toulousian leader, but only managed to cut his belt. The Southern Knights emerged victorious from the clash and proceeded to flank the main line of the Crusaders, targeting with javelins and even bolts shot by mounted crossbowmen. Foucault de Beziers' defensive positions suffered heavy casualties, but despite this held on. At this critical junction, Roger Bernard de Foix launched a second charge with his first line of heavy cavalry. He first collided head-on with de Beziers' dismounted horsemen, then rode around and outflanked them. At that point, the southern infantry entered the fray, engaging with de Beziers' line from the front. Crushed from two sides, the Crusader line finally broke. Those who could retrieve their horse managed to flee. Everyone else was slain or taken prisoner, including the Beziers brothers. When news of the defeat reached Simon de Montfort, he ordered another attack against the walls of Marmande to be conducted via land and river. Once again, Centulle d'Esterec was able to fight him off. The situation for the Crusaders was dire, but fortunately for them, help was on the way. On the 2nd of June, Prince Louis arrived with the full force of the French Royal Army and joined Amaury with his mighty host of experienced knights, veterans of the wars with England. The prince immediately launched an assault on Marmande, which succeeded in capturing the outer defences around Marmande and on the Garonne River. At this stage, d'Esterec decided to seek terms for an honourable surrender, probably hoping to spare his castrum from the horrific atrocities the Crusaders were known to commit. Louis and Amaury resisted demands from the Bishop of Saintes to execute d'Esterec and massacre the entire population. They decided to spare the valiant garrison commander and exchange him for the Beziers brothers. Unfortunately, neither the prince nor the young Montfort were able to control their soldiers. Many of them were nearing the end of their 40-day service in the crusade. Seeing an opportunity to grab some loot before returning home, they poured through the gates and massacred almost all the inhabitants of Marmande before setting the town ablaze. According to chronicler Guillaume Le Breton, 5,000 men, women and children died by the blades of the Crusaders. After this easy yet truculent victory, on the 16th of June, Louis drove his army to Toulouse, the centre of pro-Cathar resistance. The Toulousians, emboldened by the victory at Béziers and fearing a repeat of Marmande, had greatly improved the defences of their city. Raymond VII ensured that his seat of power was well stocked with provisions for a long siege. Moreover, he recruited 1,500 cavalry and foot soldiers to reinforce the militia, and he hired 2 expert engineers to build catapults and mangonels. The papal legate, Cardinal Bertrand, demanded that Raymond surrender immediately and recognized King Philippe Augustus as his overlord. Upon his refusal to do so, the legate proclaimed that death and slaughter must lead the way, that in and around Toulouse there shall remain no living man, neither noble lady, girl, nor pregnant woman. All must die in flames. Contemporary sources present scant details of the event of this siege. What we know is that Louis led a constant bombardment of the city with his own siege engines, followed by several direct assaults. But Raymond and his militia mounted a courageous and effective defence. As the weeks wore on, many amongst the Crusader ranks left the camp, having fulfilled their 40 days' duty. Those who remained suffered from widespread famine and disease due to a lack of supplies. On the 1st of August, Louis finally admitted defeat and lifted the siege. He returned to France with most of his army, leaving behind only 200 knights in Amaury's service. Other than these knights, Amaury could only count on bands of improvised crusaders trickling in from the north following the appeals of the new papal legate Conrad von Urach. Most of the actions conducted against the Cathars in this period consisted of pillaging raids, conducted with cruelty by the recently freed Beziers brothers. During the winter of 1220, the atrocities intensified. On one occasion, the Beziers band forced a man to hang his own son before he was himself hung. Raymond VII's knights, however, had the upper hand, reconquering most of the land lost in the previous campaigns. The southern leader eventually managed to apprehend the Beziers brothers, dragged them to Toulouse, and had them decapitated. Then, between early 1220 and February 1221, Raymond's forces reconquered several castra previously fallen to the Crusaders. First, Lavaur, where almost all the garrison was massacred. Then it was Puylaurens' turn, defended by Ermengarde, widow of Foucault de Béziers. Next, Montségur and Castelnaudary surrendered without a fight. Amaury de Montfort tried immediately to retake this latter castrum, but the first assault failed decisively. During the action, Amaury's younger brother Guy was killed by the defenders. Raymond continued on to the castrum of Montreal, defended by the veteran crusader Alain de Russie. The southerners successfully sapped the walls and went on to conquer the town, while Russie and a small garrison retreated to the inner tower. The Crusaders' valiant defence came to an end when a stone hurled by a mangonel cracked Russie's skull. By July 1221, Raymond held much of central Languedoc, while his ally, the Count de Foix, was making progress in the south. The Crusaders were being pushed towards eastern Languedoc, and held only Carcassonne, Narbonne and Penn in the west. The following summer, in August of 1222, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse died of a stroke. His son, 25-year-old Raymond VII, inherited the title of Count and became the undisputed leader of the southern cause. The new Count of Toulouse gathered his forces to settle scores with the Crusaders in the west, and in the spring of 1223 he laid siege to Penn. In the meanwhile, his rival Amaury de Montfort had conducted a diplomatic mission in Paris, whence he returned at the head of a relief column. Raymond beat a tactical retreat, and in a stroke of diplomatic cunning, even managed to negotiate a truce with Amaury. This truce was to be followed by peace talks at Sens, presided by Philippe Augustus. However, the French king died on the 14th of July 1223. Without his presence, the Sens conference failed, and hostilities resumed. Amaury and his forces, however, were exhausted, reduced to a mere 23 knights. On the 14th of January 1224, de Montfort sued for peace. Raymond offered generous terms, provided that Amaury fornicated off back north. De Montfort received a payment of 10,000 marks in exchange for brokering a reconciliation with the Pope. More crucially, he would retain the castra he still held, such as Narbonne, Penn and Termes. It was too early, however, for the Cathars and the southern lords to claim total victory. Immediately after the peace settlement, Pope Honorius III started pressuring the new French king, Louis VIII, to lead a new crusade. What tipped the balance was Amaury's generous donation. He would cede his remaining holdings in Languedoc to the crown. This was a golden occasion for the king to sweep into Languedoc at the head of a church-sanctioned campaign and extend his territories in the south. A new expedition would have to wait until 1226, however. Whilst corresponding with Louis VIII, the Pope had sought a rapprochement with Raymond VII. If the Count of Toulouse agreed to reject Catharism and persecute the heretics, he would be spared another northern invasion. Raymond was happy to agree with this deal, but eventually the Pope and his legates deemed him untrustworthy. In January 1226, the Council of Bourges acknowledged King Louis as the legitimate suzerain of Languedoc and sanctioned a new crusade. A new royal army, 20,000 men strong, assembled in Bourges on the 17th of May 1226. This invasion force began conquering land before they'd even taken one single step out of Bourges, for as news of an upcoming royal invasion had reached Languedoc, several southern lords sent messages to the king, pledging their allegiance. On the 28th of May, the Crusader army reached Lyon. By then, several castra, once stalwart strongholds of pro-Cathar resistance, had also decided to send messages of surrender. Béziers, Puylaurens, Carcassonne, Beaucaire, and Albi, among others, bent the knee to the king in the north. Louis continued his journey south, reaching Avignon on the 7th of June. Whilst not in Languedoc, this powerful Provençal city had been a known supporter of Raymond. On this occasion, however, the city allowed the king safe passage across its bridges. But when the first contingent, led by the Count of Blois, crossed the Rhône and raised its banners, the Avignon garrison bombarded them with stones and arrows from the battlements. It is not clear if the Avignonnese had planned a trap all along, or had misinterpreted Blois' actions as the prelude to a siege. The king dispatched a second unit to help Blois, but the Avignonnese successfully destroyed the bridge before they could cross. The furious king decided to send a message by completely blockading the city. Taking it by storm was out of the question, as it was protected by colossal walls and 2 rivers. The king's engineers set to work, building an array of mangonels, trebuchets, and pontoon bridges. Avignon responded to the bombardment in kind, targeting the Crusaders with a hail of arrows and stones. One of these landed a clean hit on the head of Amaury Copeau, the king's French engineer. The Avignonnese caused further misery to the Crusaders by staging daring sorties. One attack in particular caught the French completely by surprise while they were eating. The French responded with an equally daring assault on the 8th of August, but as they crossed a pontoon bridge, it split in half, plunging hundreds of soldiers to their death. The survivors pressed on, led by the Count of St. Pol, a close friend of the king's. The Count successfully climbed a siege ladder to the top of the city walls, but was then killed by a massive stone. King Louis immediately called off the attack. As time wore on, the king realized he had to end the siege quickly. He had received news that his long-standing rival, King Henry III of England, had taken the Atlantic port of La Rochelle. Moreover, Raymond of Toulouse had invaded the countryside around Avignon, laying waste to the French army's supply lines. Soon, the Crusader camp was ravaged by famine and disease. By September, however, Avignon was also suffering from the same plight. Both sides were exhausted and sought peace terms. Avignon ceded 300 hostages to the Crusaders, 6,000 marks, and all the garrison's weapons, including the siege engines. The city also had to forego its fortifications, which were destroyed, and pay a further indemnity to the church. After this strategic victory, most of Languedoc surrendered to Louis. The conquering king returned to Paris, vowing to return the following spring to settle accounts with the city of Toulouse. But he never would. On the 8th of November 1226, Louis VIII died of dysentery, contracted at Avignon. As his son, also named Louis, was only 12 at the time, power was handed over to his wife, Queen Blanche of Castile. With the royal army gone, Raymond of Toulouse tried to regain the upper hand, conquering Hauterive south of Toulouse in the winter of 1227. He then fortified La Béziers on the route to Carcassonne to intercept any Crusader counterattack. But the castrum was swiftly taken by one of the late king's lieutenants, Humbert de Beaujeu. The Crusaders massacred all men in town by stabbing or impaling them, and then burnt all Cathar heretics. Throughout 1227 and 1228, Beaujeu proceeded to stamp out any sign of anti-royalist rebellion, keeping Raymond constantly on the back foot. By this stage, most of his barons had either died or defected to the crown. But the young count was able to claim one last victory at the siege of Castelnaudary, 60 kilometers north of Toulouse. In the spring of 1228, his troops conquered the main castrum, pushing back the Crusader garrison inside the inner tower. Crusader reinforcements converged onto Castelnaudary from the countryside, but Raymond ordered the construction of a palisade around the castrum, which kept the northern soldiers at bay. Another relief force was dispatched from France. When Raymond got wind of it, he temporarily left the siege to stage an ambush. The French column was attacked in a wood and thoroughly annihilated, with hundreds of knights killed or taken hostage. According to chronicler Roger of Wendover, Raymond ordered for some of the prisoners to be hideously mutilated and then be sent home, as a deformed spectacle to their fellow Frenchmen. Humbert de Beaujeu had to admit defeat at Castelnaudary. Gathering all his forces in Languedoc, he set off for Toulouse. He would not attempt a siege, but rather devastate the surrounding countryside. For 3 months, his men systematically destroyed all grain and vine fields in the area, crippling the Toulousian economy. This was Beaujeu's strategic masterstroke. Raymond's army was too weak to oppose this scorched earth campaign. Thus, the Count had been forced to travel to Gaillac, 50 kilometers north of Toulouse, on a recruiting mission. The mission proved to be a failure, as he returned with only 33 knights, not enough to fight back. What was worse, his absence had been sorely felt by the Toulousians, who were dangerously low on food, money, and now also on morale. By September, Beaujeu had completed his devastation of the Toulousian countryside and moved south, occupying the territories once held by the fierce Foix family. Raymond realized that the game was up and agreed to participate in peace talks with the regent, Queen Blanche. Initial terms were discussed in January 1229, later ratified on the 12th of April with the Treaty of Meaux, or Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Meaux stipulated large reparations for the crown. It also required southern lords to demilitarize most of their castra. More importantly, they had to swear allegiance to France and the Church, and actively persecute the remaining Cathars. Raymond lost half his territories in the county of Toulouse and Provence, to the benefit of the French crown and the Pope. Raymond would still hold control of Toulouse, which was to be inherited by his daughter Joan, 9 at the time. However, the treaty imposed that Joan would have to marry Alphonse, brother of future King Louis IX. Should the couple remain childless, Toulouse would be handed over to the crown. This humiliating treaty formally put an end to the Albigensian Crusade. Fighting in Languedoc, however, was far from over. In 1232, Raymond oversaw the capture and execution of 19 heretics in Toulouse. However, his efforts were deemed lukewarm and negligent by the papal legates. Meanwhile, Pope Gregory IX remained distrustful of the formerly pro-southern lords, even if they were ostensibly cooperating with him now. To that end, the pontiff created a new religious institution called the Inquisition, which was devoted to the identification, interrogation, conversion, and if needed, execution of the Cathar heretics. His legate, Jean de Benoit, Bishop of Arles, created the first tribunals of the Inquisition in Bordeaux, Bourges, Narbonne, and Auch. Benoit's inquisitors, composed mainly of Dominican friars, toured the Languedoc and neighbouring regions, preaching and exhorting the heretics to reveal themselves. After a week of grace, those who had not come forward would be systematically hunted down and persecuted. On several occasions, Dominican inquisitors went as far as exhuming the bodies of known heretics to have their corpses beaten and burned at the stake. Such excesses prompted acts of rebellion from Cathars and even sympathetic local Catholics, with numerous cases of inquisitors being assaulted or even killed. Overall, however, the Inquisition had the upper hand, especially thanks to the help of defectors such as the infamous Robert the Bulgar, who was responsible for the burning of 183 Cathars. Gradually, the persecuted heretics left the main towns of Languedoc, fleeing mainly to the castle of Montségur, already cited by the Lateran Council in 1215 as a dangerous den of heretics. In 1233, Cathar bishop Guibert de Castres asked Raymond Peyrel, lord of this castrum, for permission to turn Montségur into the seat and head of what remained of the Cathar church. Hope for the Cathar cause was relit in 1239, when Raymond VII switched sides once more. The citizens of Narbonne, put under pressure by the Inquisition, called upon the Count of Toulouse for protection. Raymond saw this as an opportunity to recover his possessions in Provence, which he had formerly lost to King Louis IX, and launched an uprising against the French troops and the papal legates. Raymond's ally, Oliver of Termes, successfully occupied Narbonne, whilst the Count himself was busy campaigning in Provence. Then, in the late summer of 1240, Raymond VII seized Arles and Marseille, while his deputy, Raymond Roger Troncavel, was preparing to besiege Carcassonne, one of the biggest cities in Languedoc. The Troncavel host conquered Limoux and Montelieu before blockading Carcassonne in September 1240. The southern troops attacked the city walls 8 times, and 8 times were repulsed by the inhabitants. On the 11th of October, a large contingent of French royal troops arrived in reinforcement, forcing Troncavel to retreat. This was the first of a series of defeats inflicted upon the rebellious lords, many of whom defected to the enemy and swore fealty to King Louis IX. This was a setback for Raymond, but at the end of 1241 he saw an opportunity to reignite his fight when another revolt against the King of France erupted in the Saintonge region in central western France, a conflict later known as the Saintonge War. The leader of that rebellion was Hugh de Lusignan, Count of Marche. Raymond forged an alliance with Hugh, and through him, an additional alliance with his stepson King Henry III of England. King Henry saw the Southern Revolt as an occasion to reconquer lands in western France, previously controlled by his father King John. The English king landed in Royan on the western coast of France on the 20th of May 1242 and linked up with Lusignan's own forces. The English and rebel coalition clashed with the French army on the 21st of July at the castle of Taillebourg. The coalition staged an initial attack, taking a bridge across the Charente River and assaulting the castle. The French responded with a massive sortie of heavy cavalry which dispersed the attackers and chased them off to the town of Saintes. After Henry and Hugh fled to Bordeaux, their armies were left leaderless, and King Louis IX crushed them once again on the 22nd of July in a short battle north of Saintes. Raymond of Toulouse had not taken part directly in the Saintonge War. However, the defeat of Henry and Lusignan spelled doom also for his own rebellion in Languedoc, as more and more lords defected back to the crown. While these events were taking place, the Cathars at Montségur had taken advantage of the uprising to take offensive action against their enemies in the Inquisition. On the 28th of May 1242, the town of Avignonnet was visited by a group of 11 inquisitors, led by the Dominican Guillaume Arnaud. News reached Montségur, and one of its military leaders, Pierre-Roger de Mirepoix, decided to stage a raid. 12 of his soldiers, helped by a pro-Cathar insider, infiltrated the gates of Avignonnet, broke into the lodgings of the inquisitors armed with axes, and hacked them all to death. By October of 1242, Raymond VII had realized that any plans for a Cathar resurgence in Languedoc were doomed to fail, and sued for peace, returning into the French royal fold once more. But even with the recent uprising quelled, neither the crown nor the Pope could leave the recent massacre at Avignonnet unpunished. To that end, a Catholic council convened in Béziers in early 1243, which decided to cut off the head of the dragon, resolving to crush the last major centre of Cathar resistance, the castrum of Montségur. In May of 1243, a besieging French army arrived at the foot of the Pog, or rocky hill, on which the castle was perched. The army was led by Hugh des Assis, Seneschal of Carcassonne, and by Pierre Amiel, the Archbishop of Narbonne, a shared leadership which represented the joint effort of the French crown and the Pope in eradicating heresy. The numbers of the French army vary according to sources, from 2,000 to as many as 20,000. However, it is safe to estimate that Hugh des Assis marched at the head of 2,000 knights and infantry, later reinforced by foot soldiers recruited in Languedoc by Bishop Amiel, swelling their numbers. On the opposing side, the castle of Montségur housed some 500 inhabitants, of which only 150 to 200 were soldiers. The rest were women, children, and Cathar perfects, who adhered to strict pacifism and took no part in the fighting. The garrison was commanded by the knights Pierre-Roger de Mirepoix and Raymond de Peyrel, with the support of the Cathar Bishop of Toulouse, Bertrand Marty. The Cathar fortress appeared impregnable from the start to the French forces. It was perched atop a steep pog, 1,056 meters high, well out of range of the siege engine's projectiles, while the sides of the hill were too exposed to the defenders' stones and arrows. Moreover, before even getting to the castrum, the invaders would have to break through two outer fortifications. First of these was the Roc de la Tour on the northeast side, a natural platform some 600 meters away from the main walls, on which a watchtower had been built. This tower guarded the slope leading to the Barbican, a circular formation 200 meters away from the castrum. This second obstacle protected the only access to Montségur's gates, a narrow ridge flanked by two chasms. On the 13th of May, Hugh des Assis camped on the nearby Col de Tremblement and opted for a complete blockade of the hill and castle, hoping to starve out the Cathars. He estimated that, with summer starting soon, the garrison would soon run out of water. However, the defenders were well prepared for the eventuality of a lengthy siege. The castle was well stocked with provisions and well serviced by a network of wells and cisterns carved on the side of the hill. Moreover, Montségur guarded the famous Treasure of the Cathars, later speculated to feature the Holy Grail. More realistically, this was a stash of coins and jewellery donated by sympathizers, which Mirepoix and Peyrel put to good use. Not only were the Cathar leaders able to regularly pay their garrison's wages, securing their loyalty, but they also bribed some of the soldiers in the French camp, allowing for skilled Cathar climbers to leave the castle, roam the countryside for supplies, and re-enter undisturbed at night. After almost 6 months of ineffective blockade, Ude-Assis changed his strategy, opting for a frontal attack. The first assaults in November 1243 resulted in failure, as the French soldiers were repeatedly repelled whilst trying to scale the limestone walls of the Pol. Assis decided to task some specialized troops with a seemingly suicidal mission. Just before Christmas, a unit of Basque mercenaries skilled in mountain warfare scaled a cliff on the eastern side of the Pog at nighttime. The Basques secured a position on the Roc de la Tour and then proceeded to infiltrate the watchtower, killing all the sentries. By January 1244, the French had established a foothold above the hill, within firing distance from the walls of the Cathar castle. Their engineers hauled up the dismantled sections of a trebuchet designed by Durand, the Bishop of Albi, with which they proceeded to bombard the defenders' barbican. The Cathar garrison responded by building their own catapult in an attempt to destroy the enemy siege engine, but their attempts failed. In mid-February, the French had seized the barbican. According to some sources, they were helped by a local who had defected to their side. They then dismantled their trebuchet and rebuilt it on the barbican. They now had a perfect vantage point to target the interior of the castle. As the besiegers progressed closer and closer, the inhabitants of the village outside the fortress walls had to relocate inside, placing additional strain on the defenders' supplies. At this point, Assis tried to force an end to the siege by ordering an attack on the castle across the ridge, but the garrison managed to fight back. The Cathar commanders Mirepoix and Peyrel made a last-ditch attempt to dislodge the French from their positions when their men staged a desperate sortie which succeeded in pushing back the attackers, but only temporarily. Despite this fleeting victory, the two lords of Montségur knew that total defeat was only a matter of time, and on the 2nd of March 1244 opted for negotiating with one of the French commanders, Marshal Guy de Lévis. The parties agreed on a 2-week truce, after which the Cathar perfects were expected to abjure their faith or face death at the stake. During the truce, a small group of perfects escaped Montségur, taking with them the Cathar treasure. On the 16th of March, the truce terms expired. All the soldiers and civilians inside Montségur were allowed to leave unharmed, provided that they converted back to Catholicism. The majority of the garrison and the refugees, including Peyrel and Mirepoix, accepted the offer and walked free after interrogation by the Inquisition. But, as had happened many times during the Albigensian Crusade, the perfects rejected these offers. On the morning of the 16th, 225 perfects filed outside the fortress walls, led by their bishop Bertrand Marty. They voluntarily entered a pen erected outside the castle, mounted the pyres built therein, and perished among the flames. The main seat of Cathar resistance, the head of the dragon, had been cut off, but Catharism had not been completely wiped out. Chased by the Inquisition and funded by the rescued treasure of Montségur, several small Cathar groups relocated to Aragon and modern-day northern Italy, where they managed to survive for several decades. While the Albigensian Crusade was officially concluded with the Treaty of Meaux in 1229, fighting and killing continued in Languedoc until the last large-scale engagement at Montségur. The 20-year conflict and its protracted aftermath would have momentous consequences for the history of France and Europe as a whole. For one thing, the creation of the Inquisition formalized the Church's approach to dealing with heresies, sanctioning the use of non-violent and violent methods for centuries to come. The involvement of the French crown led to the expansion of France over previously de facto independent areas in Languedoc and Provence, opening the French kingdom's gates to the Mediterranean Sea. The last act of this expansion would be sealed several decades later. According to the Treaty of Meaux, after the death of Raymond VII, the county of Toulouse was inherited by his son-in-law Alphonse. After Alphonse died heirless in 1271, the county was formally absorbed by the Kingdom of France. Lastly, the prolonged campaigns of siege, raids, executions, and mass burnings exacted a heavy toll on the local population. Anywhere between 200,000 and 1 million Cathars and their sympathizers had been killed in the period between 1209 and 1229 alone. This staggering loss of life prompted authors such as Raphael Lemkin and Mark Gregory Pegg to describe this crusade as one of the most conclusive cases of genocide in religious history. This claim is disputed by other historians such as John C. Moore, who argue that the Crusaders' intention was not to systematically kill every single Cathar. In fact, conversion and reform were the policies preferred by Pope Innocent III, with violence being a final resort. However, characterized by massacres and atrocities, Moore argues that the Albigensian Crusade cannot be technically defined as a genocide according to current definitions. Regardless of the nomenclature used to describe it, the Albigensian Crusades have nonetheless gone down in history as one of Europe's most brutal and impactful religious wars, and a seminal precursor of even bloodier Christian schisms to come in future centuries, such as the Hussite Revolution and the 30 Years' War. Let us know what your interpretation of this crusade is in your comments, and let us know if you'd like us to cover other relatively lesser known medieval conflicts in the future. More videos on medieval history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.